Hey everyone, we have quite the drive to go through today. Tesla's full self-driving beta seemingly gets better and better with every software update, but this particular version will show that we are definitely still in beta and human supervision is required. And although this newest version was able to successfully drive me all the way from my home to the starting point of this drive, which was basically over an hour of zero intervention driving, once the camera started rolling, let's just say the situation became very different. You're going to see the beta struggle with things that I did not think were problems for it anymore, and based off how it performed during this drive, I'm going to go ahead and go out on a limb and say I would not be surprised if this version didn't roll out any further than it already has. And with all that being said, it is very possible that the issues you're going to see here may be isolated to my particular car, but we'll get into that a little bit later. We're going to get right into this full drive through Berkeley, California, right after I tell you about this video's sponsor. If you're anything like me, you may accidentally find yourself going down a rabbit hole or three online, and may even stumble across something that puts you on a list without even realizing it. But don't you worry, because you can cover your tracks with private internet access, a virtual private network that routes your online traffic through secure tunnels and helps to protect you from the prying eyes of those who want to view your personal data and browsing history without your consent. PIA has been my VPN of choice for years now because of their commitment to privacy and their strict no-logging data policies, which have been proven multiple times in court. You can spoof your geolocation to one of 84 countries and all 50 individual US states, which unlocks region-locked content on all major streaming services, and as a side benefit, can even help with getting a better deal on things like clothes, flights, and games. They have over 30 million downloads and are completely open source, meaning if you have any questions at all about the way it operates, you can view the actual source code for yourself. By using my special link in the description, you can get 83% off and 4 months free, which comes out to just over $2 a month, which not only is a great deal for privacy, but it now also covers an unlimited amount of devices. They have support staff available 24/7 and a 30-day money-back guarantee, so give it a try with confidence. And thanks again to PIA for being a long-term sponsor of this channel. Alright, let's get into it. We're starting off this drive at the college in Berkeley, and then we'll be making our way up into the mountains where the roads get a lot more narrow and challenging, and which will also bring out some of the regressions that I'm talking about. Doing a pretty good job of staying nice and smooth through this first roundabout. You can see a little bit of minor braking here as these pedestrians come into view, but overall pretty smooth. Then while exiting the roundabout, you can see it take the inside line through this corner, which is definitely something that there has been some major improvements on with the last few versions. Feels very human-like. No stop sign at this next intersection, but does do a pretty good job yielding to the Prius, maybe a little bit slow and cautious. Then the Prius pulls off to the side of the road and actually turns his hazards on. So, as you might be able to see, the path planner actually has the right idea. It's showing a path going around the Prius, but for some reason, it's just not executing the maneuver. I was fairly sure that this was going to be the first intervention of the drive, but luckily for the beta, the Prius actually turns off his hazards and continues on. Not really sure why it decided to stay behind the car instead of trying to pass. I guess it could have been that double yellow line there, but we've seen in previous videos, the beta usually has no problem crossing a double yellow to get around a stopped car. But these last few software versions seem to have a little bit more difficulty deciding on when to pass a stopped car, as we've seen in some of my previous videos. Kind of an odd intersection here where that van is the only one who has a stop sign, but the beta actually gets through here very smoothly. Seems to play a little game of chicken with the red Tesla in front of us. You can see we're kind of hogging the middle of the road a little bit. Personally, I probably would have slowed down a little in advance to avoid that pinch point with the truck, but it did make it through. Interesting situation here where the car that just pulled off to the road up here has his brake lights on, which confuses the beta. You heard that takeover immediately chime. It seemed to not know if it should be waiting behind that car or just passing it. It didn't end up making the right decision and just going around, but was a little bit awkward. Left-hand turn signal was on through that roundabout, which was not the proper thing to do, and I think it made that van wait a little bit longer than he needed to. But with that being said, I actually think the turn signals have improved in this version. Not to where they need to be, I think, but they have improved marginally. It It definitely still has the issue where the turn signal comes on in the direction of a sharp turn, which is very frustrating, but less random turn signal left and right action, which is a welcome improvement. Another area of improvement is these semi-blind corners where cars just kind of appear. You can see we do slow down here, but very smoothly. These are situations where older versions would have definitely slammed on the brakes and nearly come to a complete stop here, especially with the bus, but this version seems to be handling them much better. Not going to be slowing this next segment down, but do want to draw your attention to the turn signals. You can kind of see them come on as we go around these corners, which is obviously not the right thing to do. The beta was planning a path around this cyclist ahead, but then changes its mind as soon as it sees this truck pulling out into the street. This was some great, quick decision making and also remained really smooth through the whole thing, and it definitely prioritized the cyclist's safety. I always appreciate seeing vulnerable road users treated with a little extra caution. Coming up shortly here, you're going to see a big regression that surprised me quite a bit. I think there may be a problem with this version's ability to interpret map data. For example, it no longer recognizes the street that my house is on, which was a problem that was fixed in 2019, and also doesn't seem to remember the location of other things it used to know, like low visibility stop signs. And this isn't even the only example of this during this drive. The reason this is so surprising is that we've actually gone through this exact intersection before on earlier versions, and it had no problem stopping. In the beginning of the video, I mentioned it may be an issue isolated to my car, and that's because I just put the car through a complete factory reset to try to fix an unrelated issue, but after seeing some discussions on Twitter about this stop sign behavior, I think it may just be this software version. And we do have our second disengagement here when the beta obviously doesn't recognize this road closed sign and tries to go around the cones instead through that gap. I wouldn't necessarily call that one a regression though, because the beta has never been very good at reading signs, at least yet. But really curious if any of you that have used this version have had similar experiences to this, where some parts of the map data seem to be missing. Seem to have a little bit of an issue passing this pedestrian here. You can see it highlighted him in red and also played the take over immediately chime. The weird part about it is the maneuver was pretty smooth. There was no harsh braking or anything. I've noticed a lot more take over immediately chimes on this version compared to others. So not really sure what's going on there. The car seems to be driving fine, but it seems like there's a disagreement somewhere in the software. The road to our left is completely closed off with the gentleman standing in the middle. Interesting that it's not visualizing the cones right away, and it obviously knows something's blocking the road, but doesn't visualize the cones until later. This does force us into another disengagement, and I did have a little bit of a chuckle there because this guy is just not amused. And the cones are now showing up properly displaying that the road is closed. The full self-driving beta definitely has a ways to go in construction zones. I'm crossing my fingers for an update eventually that gives it the ability to read signs. It would help in so many scenarios. There is someone up ahead who backs into their driveway, and the beta does a really nice job identifying this and coming down to a nice smooth slowdown. This was very nicely handled, and detecting and controlling for obstructions early on is an area that the beta seems to be doing better and better at. As we make it to the random destination selected on the map, I go ahead and change the navigation point to force it to go through the roundabout that's ahead. Roundabouts have always been pretty tricky for the beta, and I don't have many around where I live, so always can't pass up the opportunity to give it a test when I'm around one. Although you see this roundabout does have a stop sign attached, which is frustrating, but it is what it is. There is a pedestrian walking on our left, and the beta does decide to give them the right-of-way, which was a good call and the exact same thing I would have done. Right after he crosses is probably when you or I would have entered the roundabout, but you can see the beta playing this one extra safe and yielding to all the cars to the left, which does get us honked at by the car behind. I guess you could fault it for being a little bit too cautious through here, but honestly, I think what it did was absolutely fine. I think that self-driving cars by design should be extra cautious, so I think that was just an example of that, and I don't really think the honk was really necessary. This is a pretty interesting little intersection here where traffic from our right and left do not stop. And I slowed this down and showed it to you because we're going to be approaching this intersection from the right-hand side later on in this video. And if you've made it this far into the video, well, first off, thank you very much. But also, please do consider subscribing because I'm getting very close to a goal that seemed impossible not long ago, which is 100,000 subscribers. Absolutely bananas. And thank you again for all the support. This channel would not be what it is today without you. Beta having some difficulty predicting the path for this slip lane here. You can see it wanting to do some wild maneuvers. Does end up going the correct way. Also doesn't come to a complete stop. Did we need to come to a complete stop there? I'm actually not 100% sure what we should have done there, but hopefully someone can enlighten us in the comments. We're now approaching that same intersection I mentioned before, except we're now heading in the direction of travel where we're not supposed to stop. There is a pretty steady stream of traffic approaching from the right though, and you can see the Beta having a little bit of difficulty in deciding when to go, and I actually don't really blame it. This is something that I can see an overly cautious human driver doing as well, and to be honest, I'm just surprised that this wasn't another instance where we got honked at. Approaching the roundabout from the other side, you can see no stop sign this time, and the Beta has no problem rolling right into the roundabout because it's clear and also kind of uses the turn signals properly too. It signaled left to get into the roundabout and right to leave the roundabout. Don't know whether that was on purpose or just by luck, but I'm leaning towards luck. We'll now be getting into a much more narrow section of the roads, and you can see at first the Beta does a really nice job with a nice gradual slowdown to get us through an appropriate speed to get through here, but then halfway through kind of gets a little bit tripped up when things get a little bit tighter, and you can see it goes down to about 2 miles an hour to make sure that it can clear everything through here. I've seen it fit through much more narrow gaps with no problem, so not quite sure what tripped it up there. Have a few more narrow road traffic interactions up here, the first of which is this left-hand turn. You can see it in the beginning it's yielding for this truck ahead, but then decides it has plenty of time and goes for it, but a van is coming down the hill, which puts us into a little bit of a pinch point. You can see the Beta kind of tucked away at the edge of the curb there to try to get out of his way as much as possible. Another vehicle then approaches from the front, and you can see the Beta kind of dive off the road here to try to give as much room as possible until he pulls off to the road and gives us the right of way, which the Beta takes. That was a fine maneuver, but probably could have been just a little bit more comfortable. And unfortunately, another part of that big regression we talked about earlier, where the Beta was not responding to this stop sign anywhere near soon enough. And I did go ahead and send autopilot snapshots of both of these instances back to the team, so hopefully they can review this to figure out what's going on. Again, just like before, this is an intersection that we've already gone through on previous videos that the car had no problem stopping for. The stop sign itself was also more visible than last time, so kind of surprising that it detected it so late. Here's another interaction that it usually does a really good job with, but for some reason, not this time. You can see these two trucks are in the road, kind of giving each other the right of way. We have to pull up into that gap to let this truck go, but autopilot does not want to do it. I tried to give it as much of an opportunity as I could without being super awkward to do the maneuver itself, but it didn't seem like it wanted to do it. And another slightly awkward situation happens again up here with that same FedEx truck we were following, but he is now backing down the road. It's obviously acting a little bit cautious, as I think I would be too, but he's waving his hands and saying something to us that I don't even know what he said, but he was a little bit frustrated that we took even that long. These streets are not for the faint of heart, and people expect you to take the right of way immediately and not be overly cautious. This is something I expect out of a place like San Francisco, but actually surprised me a little bit in Berkeley. Our drives typically aren't like this. People have a little bit more chill out here, at least usually. Coming up to this intersection, we have our left-hand turn signal on for some reason as we're going straight. It drives me crazy, and we also don't immediately give this pedestrian room. I wish it would offset for pedestrians a little bit earlier to show more intention to them. But credit for where it's due, you're not going to find any other vehicles in the autonomous vehicle space making its way through these streets. It's actually doing a really good job not overreacting to a lot of these situations. But I kind of wished for more of a reaction in the situation ahead. You can see on the visualization the darker colored cars are the ones that are parked and the brighter ones are the ones that are moving, but for some reason it doesn't highlight this truck up here as a moving vehicle at all. It stays basically gray the entire time. Although it did show on the visualizations that it was getting ready to slam on the brakes, this was not the proper thing to do here. I have no idea why it did not detect that truck properly. That seems like one of those situations where the beta should be at a point now where it can figure that out all on its own, and I'm kind of disappointed to see it, if I'm honest with you. And of course did hit the snapshot button again, so hopefully the Tesla engineers can review and use this data. Some more planning and control issues ahead here too, where you can see we basically came to a full and complete stop here, even though we have plenty of room to get through here. This definitely wasn't a narrow enough gap to warrant a stop. And then it sees this motorcycle as something it should yield for and just stops. And again, I do try to give beta all the opportunity in the world to figure this out on its own, but it has zero sense of urgency, and it might sit here all day trying to yield for this motorcycle. But I can tell you, unlike the Prius from before, this one ain't moving, so I do override the accelerator pedal here to force it to move forward. And after this more control problems, you can see it kind of swerve towards these trash cans on the right-hand side before it corrects itself. And overall, in this certain section of road, the steering wheel not feeling very confident at all. I'm not really sure why this was the case. These seem like the same kind of roads and situations it's been doing a great job at typically, but for some reason, this specific stretch of road, major problems. But at least this time it does go around the mail truck all on its own. This version of the beta seems wildly inconsistent to me. Typically, I can kind of use a specific version for a while and figure out what it's good at and where it's struggling, but this version feels different in that I don't really know what it's going to have problems with or what it's going to do at any given time. It can have a perfect drive like you're seeing right now and go intervention free for hours, but then when a seemingly simple scenario appears, like a pickup truck making a U-turn in the middle of the road, it falls flat on its face. I think consistency is key for having a comfortable experience, and in my opinion, this version kind of feels like a step backwards, at least in these kinds of roads. And I will say again that these issues very well could be isolated to my car, and I'll go into a little bit more detail about that, just in case there's a Tesla employee who's watching who can get this higher up on the chain. My car, which is now considered a legacy Model S, has been having data connectivity issues for the past 6 or 7 months now, and nothing has been able to solve it. Voice commands won't work, Smart Summon never connects, and the Tesla app takes forever to connect to the car. And I've had someone from Tesla service take a look and even try reinstalling fresh firmware, but nothing seems to work. They said it was likely a hardware problem and I'd have to bring it in for further diagnosis, but after factory resetting the car myself, magically everything started working perfectly again. No more data connectivity issues for a week straight. Solved, I thought, until I re-enabled the FSD beta and immediately all the data connectivity issues came right back. Perhaps my car is stuck in a weird software glitch, but if you happen to have any insight into this or experience something similar, I'd really appreciate if you left a comment. Another little naughty move up here. We have a left turn to make here, and we should be going beyond this truck and then making the left turn after those pylons, but autopilot goes the easier way. But the easier way is not the legal way, so I do go ahead and submit another snapshot here. I don't know how many snapshots I'm allowed per drive, but I do hope that these are getting back to where they need to get to. Even though these roads aren't as narrow as the previous ones, they still are fairly narrow, and we do have another oncoming car interaction up here. You can see as they approach, autopilot begins to give them the right-of-way, but then as soon as it sees them yielding, immediately continues forward, which I thought was very nicely handled. You may have noticed that Prius come to a screeching halt, and that was because there was actually deer that crossed the road. Not sure if you saw that. Our navigation route does have us going right, but I was very curious if the deer would show up into the visualization. So after these cars go by, I do end up taking over here to go and check that out, but I'm not counting that one as a disengagement. And yeah, to my surprise, there's 3 wild deer, a couple of babies, and it looks like a mama just strolling the streets. I don't see anything on the visualization, which was a little bit disappointing, but man, stay safe out there, you guys. We have another narrow road interaction up here where as we continue through the stop sign, a car appears in front of us, but the beta does a really nice job yielding to them, giving them the right of way, and continuing without much fuss. Does seem to be getting better at handling a lot of these interactions, better and better with every update. We have another human kind of interaction up here where as we approach the stop sign, you can see a gentleman who is getting ready to cross the street, but he does give us the right of way. You can see him wave us through the intersection here. At first the beta kind of hesitates, but does end up proceeding. While situations like that are seemingly pretty obvious to us humans, I think that can actually be a pretty difficult scenario for a computer, so I'm actually fairly happy with the way that that went down. Although I highly doubt that it was reacting to his hand waving us through the intersection, in fact I'm sure it wasn't reacting to that, it did react appropriately to what it was supposed to do based on him not proceeding into the crosswalk. Another situation here where there's a pedestrian talking to somebody inside the car, and you can see the beta being very cautious indeed and trying to give them as much room as it possibly could, getting very close to that truck in the process. Another example of it prioritizing vulnerable road users' safety. It doesn't care how close it has to get to other cars as long as it leaves as much room as possible to the pedestrian. I thought this was pretty impressive as well. You can see the pedestrian walking to our right, and initially it starts yielding for them, thinking it was going to enter the crosswalk in front of us, but when she turns to the right, it immediately continues forward and through the intersection. Very nicely done, except for this right-hand turn signal on the entire time, and then the left-hand turn signal for some reason coming out of it. Up ahead, the beta makes a pretty weird decision that kind of stops a lot sooner than it needs to. You see on the screen, everything is visualized properly. The stop sign's way ahead, but it comes down to basically a full and complete stop, like 100 feet before the actual intersection where it needs to. Everything on the visualization looked correct. It looked like it was correctly mapping out everything around it and knew where the stop sign and everything else was, so not exactly sure of the reason it did this. I'm willing to bet that if we would have gone through that exact same intersection again, we would have had a different result, which again brings me back to the inconsistency. Interaction with a mail truck ahead, you can see him pulling out there. The beta does yield to him a little bit awkwardly, but doesn't come down to a full stop and was able to maintain momentum the entire time. And up ahead, we have a fairly tough, unprotected left turn. Interestingly, you can see the turn signal turn on for a moment here and then turn off. Not sure why it decided to not signal for this maneuver, but it is a fairly tough, unprotected left. Visibility is very low from both sides. Then the turn signal does come back on when it's actually making the maneuver, and it does actually do this a lot better than I thought it was going to, so very nice. And that was one of those scenarios where I thought by looking at the intersection, it would be something that the beta would struggle with, but it ended up doing it pretty much perfectly, minus the turn signal thing, of course. It's getting harder and harder for me to tell what's going to trip it up. We have a pedestrian in the road ahead and a truck with the door open with another pedestrian inside, and he decides to get out the same time an oncoming vehicle approaches. Autopilot then folds the mirrors for some reason and takes just a little bit too long to get us through the intersection. You can see that other car backs up to give us as much room as possible. Very polite, thank you. And although it was a little hesitant towards the end of that interaction, I think overall it was handled really nicely. Always a good move to go slow around pedestrians. That's the sound of the interior camera dying, so let's summarize. We had a total of 6 disengagements, some of which I do consider pretty severe and which feel brand new to this version. The trouble it's having with stop signs that were handled perfectly in previous versions is a big head scratcher to me, but again, it may be isolated to my car and I await your feedback on that one. It also doesn't seem to have any kind of sense of urgency for stopped vehicles, which caused one of our accelerator pedal interventions, and it definitely got lucky with the Prius in the beginning of the video, because I think if it were left by itself, it would have stayed behind it and the motorcycle with nobody on it forever. I'd really like to see it improved in the future where it reasons on things based off time. I hope this is a good glimpse of what the beta is today, on my vehicle at least, and thank you so much for watching. Until next time, everyone.